All right, today we're diving into a pretty fascinating case, really. J. Frank Hickey,
Oh, yeah.
a killer, active in the late 1800s, early 1900s, went by the name, or I guess he got the nickname, the Postcard Killer. And it's so interesting because outwardly, very respectable, involved with his church and the YMCA, but, as we'll find out, he had a really dark side.
Classic case of appearances can be deceiving, right?
Yes.
But what makes Hickey so fascinating, I think, is that he's one of the first, examples we have of criminal profiling.
Wow, okay.
So we're going to be looking at his crimes, the clues that he left, and how those clues were used, to kind of get inside the mind of a killer.
I like that.
Yeah.
So let's start unpacking this. Hickey was born in 1865 to Irish immigrants. And later in life, he actually claimed that he was abused by his father. I mean, we can't confirm that, but it's an interesting detail for sure.
Yeah, it's a potential contributing factor to, his later behavior.
Right. And speaking of his later behavior, at just 18 years old, he commits his first murder.
That's young.
I know, right? His victim was Edwin Moray, a co-worker at a drugstore.
Okay.
And get this, the motive was to protect his own job.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, Hickey poisoned Moray because he was afraid that Moray's alcoholism would somehow put his own job at risk.
Oh, so he's already showing that kind of like cold, calculating,
right,
like self-preservation
exactly
taking over.
And the audacity, like he actually contacts the police after the murder.
No way.
Wow.
Pretending to be concerned.
I know. It's unbelievable.
It's chilling. It really is.
And to make matters even more complicated, or interesting, I guess, this murder, they just thought it was poisoning at the time, right? So they didn't even suspect him of murder.
So it was just attributed to like a natural
causes, exactly.
Oh, wow. So he got away with it completely.
Yeah.
And it really speaks to, I think, the kind of cunning and premeditation that we're going to see throughout his entire career.
Totally. So like right away, we're seeing he's not a crime of passion kind of guy.
No.
It's very calculated.
Very calculated.
And he's already thinking steps ahead, right?
Yeah, very strategic.
So now fast forward a few years, we see Hickey involved with the Freemasons.
Okay.
Which seems like,
a respectable.
Yeah, a total contradiction to what we just talked about.
Like community?
Yeah, very upstanding citizen, right?
Right.
He rises through the ranks. He actually even becomes a master Mason. So it's like, how do we reconcile these two sides of his personality?
Right. And that's where, we have to address this common misconception that Hickey achieved the 32nd degree in Freemasonry, which is the highest rank.
Okay.
And that this somehow played a role in his crimes.
I've heard that.
But that's just not true. The reality is that Hickey was actually expelled from the Freemasons for stealing alcohol.
He was kicked out.
Yeah.
Wow.
So again, we see this pattern of dishonesty, this kind of disregard for the rules, even within an organization that's supposed to be, about brotherhood and morality.
That's a good point. So what does that tell us, that he was kicked out? Like how does that inform how we understand him?
I think it reinforces this idea that Hickey was very good at maintaining this facade of respectability while secretly engaging in, criminal behavior. And it also tells us that his crimes were really not connected to any supposed influence or power within the Freemasons.
That's a really important clarification.
Yeah, definitely.
Because, you can see how people would draw that connection, like, oh, he was this high-ranking Freemason, so he must have used that to his advantage.
Exactly. But the reality is much simpler and also much more disturbing.
It's true. Okay, so unfortunately, his criminal activity doesn't stop there. In 1902, he murders again. And this time, it's an 11-year-old boy, a newspaper vendor named Michael Kruk in Central Park. And this feels... It does, and it's like even more violent than the first one.
Yeah, this is definitely an escalation, I think, in Hickey's behavior. It's not just about self-preservation anymore. Right. We see a potential shift towards something more predatory. It's interesting to note, too, that there's no evidence of sexual assault in this case.
Yeah.
Which contrasts with his later crimes.
Okay.
So that's something to keep in mind as we go forward.
Interesting. So then in 1911, his third and most notorious murder, the one that really kind of earns him that Postcard Killer nickname, he strangles and sexually assaults a 7-year-old boy, Joey Joseph, in Lackawanna, New York.
Wow. So this is where we really see, I think, the full scope of Hickey's depravity.
Yeah.
The violence has really intensified. And now there's this clear sexual component to the crime.
Yeah, it seems like something changed in him.
Absolutely. Something shifted in his psyche and his motivations.
And this is where the infamous postcards come in. after he murders Joey Joseph, he starts sending these chilling postcards.
Postcards, I know.
To the police and the media, he's taunting them with cryptic clues about the boy's location.
Wow. Bold move.
I know.
So, like, what was he trying to achieve with these postcards?
Well, it's hard to say for sure, but in one of the postcards, he writes, Joseph will be found in the bottom of a water closet with 3 seats.
Okay, well, that's just disturbing. But, I mean, was he actually trying to help the police find the boy?
It's not that simple.
Okay.
I mean, keep in mind, he also uses these postcards to kind of mislead and misdirect.
So he's playing game.
He is. He's playing a very twisted game.
But he also seems to be reveling in, like, the notoriety of it all.
Right. Like, it's not enough for him to commit these crimes. He needs to be recognized. He needs to exert control. He wants to be feared.
Right. It's almost like he's turning the investigation into this perverse performance.
Exactly. And the thing is, these postcards, as disturbing as they were, they ended up playing a crucial role in his capture.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, we'll get into the details in a bit, but I think it's fascinating how something so sinister can also become a window into the mind of a killer.
It is. It's like he's inadvertently providing the investigators with a roadmap to his own psychology.
You could say that, yeah.
But this is also, remember, the very early 20th century.
Right.
The idea of a killer communicating with the authorities like this, taunting them, it's unprecedented. And it really marks the beginning of this new era in criminal investigation, an era where understanding the criminal mind becomes as important as the physical evidence.
That's a great point. So while these postcards were horrific, they were also groundbreaking from an investigative standpoint.
It's kind of a double-edged sword, isn't it?
It is, a very sharp one. So let's dig into how exactly those postcards helped investigators and ultimately led to Hickey's arrest. We'll also talk about the trial, the verdict, and the legacy of this case, which, believe it or not, had a profound impact on the development of modern criminal profiling.
I'm ready when you are.
We were talking about how those postcards, as creepy as they were, gave investigators this, like, unexpected look into Hickey's mind.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, isn't it? Like, this guy, he's trying to be all mysterious and controlling, but he ends up giving them the very information they need to catch him.
It's almost like he couldn't help himself, like that urge to brag or to taunt. It was just too strong.
Right, exactly. And remember, this is back when the whole idea of a killer communicating with the cops like this, it was practically unheard of.
It's like something out of a movie.
I know, right? But it really did help to push forward the whole field of criminal investigation. People started to see that there was this whole psychological aspect to these crimes.
So how did these insights from the postcards actually play out in the trial? Did it help the prosecution build a stronger case?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the trial was a huge media circus. You had this seemingly respectable guy, church-going, involved in the community, and then bam, he's revealed to be this cold-blooded killer.
I bet.
Yeah. And the postcards, they became a key part of the prosecution's case. They painted this picture of Hickey as a cunning, manipulative individual who got off on taunting the authorities.
So it wasn't just about proving he did it, but also showing what kind of person he was.
Exactly. They wanted to show the jury that this wasn't just a crime of passion, This was something premeditated, something calculated.
Right. But the postcards couldn't have been the only evidence.
Right. But the postcards couldn't have been the only evidence, right?
Oh, of course not.
Yeah.
I mean, they had physical evidence, witness testimonies, even a confession from Hickey himself.
He confessed.
He did. But the postcards, they added this extra layer to the whole thing, They gave the jury a glimpse into his mind, his twisted sense of humor.
And that line about the demon whiskey, right? He actually takes responsibility for 4 murders.
Yeah, that always sends chills down my spine. The demon whiskey will then have 1 more victim, making 4 in all.
It makes you wonder, could there be another victim out there? One that we don't even know about?
It's possible. I mean, Hickey traveled a lot. He often disappeared for months at a time.
So there could be a whole other chapter to this story that we're just missing.
It wouldn't surprise me. But back to the trial. With all the evidence they had, did the defense try to argue that he was insane? They did. They tried to paint this picture of him as mentally unstable, someone driven by these uncontrollable urges. They brought up his alleged abuse as a kid, talked about his erratic behavior.
Did it work? Did the jury believe them?
It's interesting because the verdict suggests that they were really wrestling with that question. They ended up finding him guilty of second-degree murder, which meant he avoided the death penalty.
Okay, so not insane enough to be completely innocent.
Right, but get this. 2 of the jurors actually held out. They believed he was insane and shouldn't be executed.
Wow, so even back then, they were struggling with how to deal with mental illness in the criminal justice system.
Yeah, it wasn't a clear-cut case, that's for sure.
No. And I think it forced people to confront this uncomfortable truth that even seemingly ordinary people can be capable of these horrific acts.
Absolutely. And it brings us back to the impact this case had on criminal profiling.
Yeah, I mean, you could argue that Hickey's postcards, as disturbing as they were like this unintentional blueprint for early profilers.
Like a how-to guide on understanding a criminal mind.
In a way, yes. They showed that by analyzing a criminal's communication, you can learn a lot about their motivations, their modus operandi.
Give me an example. What kind of information could they get from these postcards?
Well, take that line about the drunk crazed brain, for instance. On the surface, it seems like he's just trying to deflect blame, right? Creating this false image of the perpetrator as some out-of-control drunk.
Right.
But to a profiler, that tells them something about Hickey's thinking. He's smart, he's manipulative, and he's capable of creating a narrative to mislead the police.
So it's not just what he's saying, but how he's saying it. They're analyzing his word choice, his tone, everything.
Exactly. They're looking for patterns, inconsistencies, anything that might shed light on his personality and his mental state.
Like puzzle pieces.
Yeah, exactly. And the fact that he's using postcards at all, that's significant too.
Why is that?
Well, think about it. A postcard is a very public form of communication. He could have sent letters if he wanted to be discreet.
So you wanted people to see these messages.
It seems that way. And that feeds into that whole desire for notoriety we talked about earlier.
He couldn't resist the urge to leave his mark, to make sure everyone knew it was him.
That's right.
Yeah.
But it also raises this question of how to deal with a criminal like this. You know, does responding to his taunts, does trying to decipher his clues, does that just encourage him further?
That's a good point. It's a tricky situation, right? You want to use every piece of information to catch the guy, but you don't want to feed his ego.
Exactly. It's a delicate balance.
Yeah.
But in Hickey's case, his need to be recognized, it ultimately led to his downfall. Those postcards, the very things he thought would give him control, they ended up being his undoing.
It's like something out of Greek mythology, you know, hubris and all that.
I like that. It really does highlight the complex and often unpredictable nature of criminal behavior.
And you mentioned earlier that there was some debate among the jurors about Hickey's mental state.
Right.
Do you think this debate played a role in shaping how people thought about criminal behavior? Did it push investigators to think differently about the why behind these crimes?
Absolutely. I mean, before criminal profiling became more widely accepted, investigations often focused solely on the physical evidence, witness statements, that sort of thing. But cases like Hickey's, where there were these questions about the offender's mental state and motivation, they forced investigators to broaden their perspective.
So it wasn't just about figuring out who did it, but also why they did it.
Right, and that's where psychology comes in. Hickey's case, and those debates about his mental state, they helped pave the way for a more nuanced understanding of criminal behavior. Investigators started digging deeper, looking beyond the surface to try and understand the motivations, the thought processes, the whole picture.
It's a whole new way of looking at crime, right?
Absolutely. It's not just about catching the bad guy anymore. It's about understanding what makes them tick and hopefully using that knowledge to prevent future crimes.
So how did this new focus on psychology actually change the techniques that early profilers were using? What were they doing differently?
One of the key things was this recognition that different types of criminals tend to exhibit different behavioral patterns.
Makes sense.
Right? Like a crime that's fueled by rage or passion is going to look very different from a crime that's been carefully planned out.
Oh, for sure.
And the way a criminal interacts with their victims, the things they say, the choices they make, all of these details can provide valuable clues about their personality, their modus operandi.
Like a fingerprint, but for their mind.
Exactly.
Right.
And this led to the development of these early profiling systems where investigators would try to create a profile of the unknown offender based on the characteristics of the crime scene, the victim, all the details.
So they were trying to build a picture of the criminal before they even knew who they were looking for.
In a sense, yes. They would consider things like how much planning was involved, the level of control exerted over the victor, the types of weapons used, any signature behaviors or rituals.
That's fascinating. It sounds almost intuitive, but also incredibly complex. How did they even figure out which factors were the most important? And were these early profiles accurate?
It was a lot of trial and error at first. As they studied more cases, They started to refine their methods, figuring out which factors were the most predictive of certain behaviors. And to answer your question, no, these early profiles weren't always spot on.
But they were a start.
They were a start, and they helped to narrow down the pool of suspects to give investigators a place to start.
That makes sense. So even though it was a relatively new field, it sounds like those early profilers were already making some pretty significant progress in understanding criminal behavior.
Yeah, they were definitely onto something. But there's another aspect of Hickey's story that we haven't really touched on, and I think it's important to bring it up.
What's that?
The victims. We've been focusing so much on Hickey and his motivations, but it's crucial to remember that behind every true crime story, there were real people who suffered unimaginable loss.
That's a really important point. It's easy to forget about the human cost of these crimes when you get caught up in the details.
I know, right? But it's so important to remember that Edwin Morey, Hickey's first victim, he was a young man struggling with addiction. He had a family, friends, a life that was cut short. And his story often gets overshadowed by the notoriety of his killer.
It's tragic. And what about Michael Kruk, the newspaper boy?
Sadly, we don't know much about him. He was just 11 years old when Hickey brutally murdered him in Central Park.
11 years old, it's heartbreaking.
It is. And it reminds us of the vulnerability of children, of the devastating consequences of violence. And then there's Joey Joseph, the 7-year-old whose case ultimately brought Hickey down.
That one was particularly disturbing, with the sexual assault and the postcards.
Yeah, Joey Joseph's case is the one that most people associate with the Postcard Killer nickname. But we have to remember that he was a real child, with a whole life ahead of him. His murder shook the community to its core.
And the fact that Hickey might have had other victims, that just adds another layer of tragedy to this whole thing.
It does. It means there might be families out there who still don't have answers, who are still wondering what happened to their loved ones.
It's a sobering thought. So we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've talked about Hickey's crimes, his twisted psychology, the development of criminal profiling, the impact his case had on the field of investigation. What are some of the key takeaways you hope our listeners will walk away with?
I think the most important takeaway is that even the most horrific crimes can teach us valuable lessons. As disturbing as it is, Hickey's case helped advance our understanding of criminal behavior, and it led to the development of modern profiling techniques that are used today to solve crimes and save lives.
It's like, in a way, his darkness helped shed light on the darkness within us all.
Yeah, I guess you could say that. But it also reminds us that evil can lurk beneath the surface of even the most seemingly ordinary individuals.
And that we should always be vigilant.
Exactly. Are there any final thoughts you'd like to leave our listeners with? I would encourage everyone to keep learning about true crime. It's a fascinating subject, even though it can be unsettling. But it teaches us a lot about human nature, about the justice system, and about the importance of fighting for the victims.
That's a great point. And for anyone who wants to learn more about J. Frank Hickey, the Postcard Killer, we've got a ton of resources in the show notes. Articles, books, even some archival materials. And of course, be sure to subscribe to The Deep Dive for more deep dives into the world of history, science, and culture.
And remember, the world of true crime is always changing. There are new cases, new theories, new insights emerging all the time. So stay curious, stay informed, and keep those critical thinking skills sharp.
I love that. Stay curious, stay informed. Great advice. Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the story of J. Frank Hickey, the Postcard Killer. Thanks for joining us. So we spent all this time really digging into the crimes of J. Frank Hickey, the Postcard Killer, and, how his case, made those early investigators really stop and think about the criminal mind.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it was a turning point, right? It showed that looking at behavior and communication, all that stuff could be just as crucial as the physical evidence they were used to focusing on.
Yeah. So crazy to think about it. Hickey, in a way, without even meaning to, he laid the groundwork for, modern profiling, how we understand criminals today.
Oh, that's a good point.
But let's switch gears a little bit and talk about his, that whole thing with the Freemasons. We touched on it earlier, but I think it's worth revisiting. You mentioned that there's this misconception about Hickey reaching some high rank within the organization, higher than he actually did.
Right, yeah. A lot of people think that Hickey got to the 32nd degree, which is the highest, in Freemasonry. And they think that somehow that played a part in his crimes.
Okay, yeah.
But that's just not true at all. The records, they show very clearly that Hickey was kicked out of the Freemasons way before his most, well-known crimes. He never even got close to a high rank.
So why do you think that idea, that misconception is still around? Where'd it come from?
Well, I think it's partly because the Freemasons, they've always had this kind of mysterious aura, right? Very secretive
Oh,
organization.
yeah, for sure.
And so that secrecy, it kind of leads to speculation, right? Conspiracy theories.
Yeah, it's easy to picture, like, some high-level Freemason using his power to get away with stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But with Hickey, the facts just don't back that up at all.
Right. It's a good reminder to always be kind of critical of the information that's out there. Don't believe everything you read, especially when it comes to sensationalized stories.
Yeah, exactly. Don't believe everything you see on those documentaries either.
Oh, definitely.
They love to, play up the mystery.
But, okay, let's talk about his expulsion from the Freemasons.
Okay.
What do we know about that? Was that a major turning point for him, do you think?
It's tough to say for sure, but it definitely tells us something about him, The
Hmm.
reason he was expelled was for stealing alcohol.
Really?
Yeah.
Huh.
So we're seeing that pattern again. Dishonesty. Willingness to break the rules to get what he wants.
Yeah, yeah. So it fits with what we already know. Hickey's very good at keeping up appearances, looking respectable, while secretly doing all this shady stuff.
Right. Two sides to the same coin.
Exactly. It's kind of scary,
Uh,
Makes you wonder who else around us might be hiding something like that.
It's a chilling thought, isn't it?
Hmm.
Hickey's case, I think it just reminds us
Yeah.
that evil can take on so many different forms.
Right.
It can be hidden right in plain sight behind this mask of, normalcy.
So true. Makes you think you should always pay attention, trust your gut.
Oh, absolutely.
All right.
And never ignore those red flags, those little things that just feel off.
Yeah, yeah. Speaking of red flags, let's go back to that line, the creepy line from one of the postcards. The demon whiskey will then have one more victim, making 4 in all.
Oh, yeah, right. That's the one that gets me.
So he's basically taking credit for 4 murders there, right?
Right.
But only 3 have been officially, tied to him. So could there be another victim out there, a case that's just gone cold, forgotten about?
It's possible. I mean, it's a question that investigators have been trying to answer for, over 100 years. There's no solid proof of a 4th victim.
Right.
But Hickey, he moved around a lot, vanished for long periods. So there's definitely room for other crimes to have happened that we just don't know about.
Ugh, that's a creepy thought. It just goes to show we might never really know the full extent of what Hickey did.
Yeah, you're probably right.
And it raises these bigger questions about serial killers in general. Like, what makes them get more and more violent? How do they even pick their victims? These are questions that people are still trying to figure out, even today.
You're right. And Hickey's case, it shows how many different things can, come together to create a serial killer.
Mm.
Could it be that childhood abuse he talked about, getting kicked out of the Freemasons? The fact that he could live this double life, fooling everyone.
Right, right.
It's probably not just one thing, right? It's all these things mixed together like a recipe for disaster.
Yeah. It's kind of disturbing to realize how complex, how unpredictable the human mind can be.
It is. And it makes the job of those profilers even more difficult and more important.
Because they're not just trying to solve the crime, they're trying to understand the darkest parts of, human nature itself.
Exactly. But by doing that, they're also making the world a little bit safer. By studying people like Hickey, they can figure out new ways to stop these crimes from happening, to protect potential victims.
That's a good point. So we're wrapping up this deep dive now. What's the one thing you want our listeners to really take away from all this?
I think it's just the idea of being vigilant. Hickey, he shows us that evil can be anywhere, even in the places you least expect it. We got to trust our gut feelings,
Yeah.
Notice those red flags and speak up if something seems wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd also add, we shouldn't forget about empathy. It's easy to get drawn into the sensational parts of true crime, but we got to remember these cases, they involve real people who've been through something awful. So we should honor them by trying to prevent these tragedies from happening again.
Well said. And for anyone listening who's interested in this stuff, true crime, the human mind, all of that, keep learning, keep asking those tough questions. There's always more to discover.
Love that. Keep learning, keep asking questions. Great advice. All right, so that wraps up our deep dive into J. Frank Hickey, the Postcard Killer. Thanks for joining us, everyone.